my task is to introduce the speaker, Dr. Manu Mangattu. So if I read this curriculum vitae of him, it will be gone to another book, and he himself has written like 7 books, and I don't know what to talk of him. He's a poet, an editor, a proofreader, a critic. He's the chief editor of the AJILE Literary Journal, and I would like to quote him. He calls himself a brooding romanticist in poetry, a doubtful debutant in fiction, and a morbid classicist in criticism, as a poor, hapless lunatic seeking asylum in poetry. So I can tell you that our speaker for today is intensely passionate about poetry, and that is precisely the topic for the day. Here lies truth of narration, when the confessional meets the postmodern in poetry. So let's think about the facts that we have learned about confessional poetry, right? What was Emil Rosenthal thinking when he read Robert Lowell's poetry and termed it confessional? And let's imagine the time when Robert Lowell was who himself would become the teacher of 2 of the major confessional poets, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. I won't be saying much more. Let's dig. That will be just the surface. Let's dig in with Manu sir's lecture, and let's make confessional poetry and postmodern meet in his session. I welcome you, sir, to deliver your lecture.
Thank you, Richu, for the novel way of introduction, and thank you for introducing me, and thank you for introducing people to today's topic as well. Though I wonder whether I will be able to do full justice to what you said, since confessional poetry. Probably I won't be speaking a lot about confessional poetry today. It is good if we have time. If we had world enough and time, lady, it wouldn't have been a crime to speak at length on confessional poetry. But unfortunately, we have time limitations, and so I would try to stick more to the topic we have at hand, which has more to do with the meeting between confessional poetry and postmodernism. And I have given a brief first part of my title, Here Lies Truth of Narration. Now, I'm sure that that part will set the ball rolling by making you think a little bit about truth and lies. Here lies truth of narration. So, where truth lies, or where lies tell the truth, or where a lie tells the truth, there are some interesting questions to ponder. Now, as I begin this lecture, first of all, let me thank the AIFEST forum for this opportunity. For me, AIFEST is like a foster mother, and it is probably the 4th or 5th time that I am giving a lecture on this platform. So it is like homecoming for me, and it's such a delight to be among some of the wonderful speakers that we have in the few days that we are discussing postmodernism. Now, as I begin my lecture, I would like to shed a little bit of light into the topics that we have for our paper presentation sessions. Now, what interests me or what disinterests me is the fact that though we have, I went through the list of the paper presentations, and we have close to 100 paper presentations, which is extraordinary, very good. And I also found that there are many UG and PG students who are presenting papers, which is again very good. That is what any conference should do. It should not only be about fostering and improving the academic standards of our teachers and worrying about the APA score and the CAS, but it should also be a launch pad for budding talents. But what I found rather disinteresting about the titles for these paper presentations was that there wasn't a single title. Probably one or two may have missed my attention, there wasn't a single title that spoke about postmodern poetry. Now, what is happening? We are having a conference, a 3-day international conference on postmodernism. Nobody said it was about postmodern philosophy or postmodern theory or postmodern fiction, but the general sense seems to be that it is a conference on postmodern fiction. Most of the people have something to do with postmodern fiction as they speak about, as they will be speaking about the various aspects of postmodernism as it exists in our society. Richu, am I audible?
Yes, sir, perfectly.
Hello?
Yes, sir, you are. We can hear you from this part.
Sir, go ahead. We can hear you.
You're audible, sir.
Hello?
You are audible, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you. Thank you, whoever was telling me I was audible, right? Okay. So I hope I will remain audible as, I hear some sound.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, we have no problem at the receiving end, but at the producing end.
Wait a moment. Okay, I hope all is fine and God is in his heaven and we all are here in this lecture. So, am I audible? Please, once again, I'm just asking.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay, fine.
You're perfectly visible.
Okay,
Everything is
fine. So, this is what I have observed about the topics that people have chosen for their paper presentations. And I also observe that this trend is being practiced by PhD scholars as well for their PhD thesis. Most of the topics that we find in today's PhDs have nothing to do with postmodern poetry, though a lot of postmodernism is there in our academic circles. And interestingly, I don't think that people don't choose poetry because they don't like it. I don't think people don't choose poetry because they find it difficult. I think people don't choose poetry because most scholars tell that their supervisors discourage them, saying postmodern poetry is not the thing that you can work with because it is difficult, it is not a proper thing to work with. If it is fiction, you will have a lot of materials to work on, so many things. So I guess part of the reason why poetry is sidelined in discussions on the postmodern, part of the reason is a flimsy presupposition that postmodern poetry is not comfortable to handle. Whatever it be, my dear friends, this lecture is about that poetry that ignored, ridiculed, abhorred, marginalized, sidelined poetry, postmodern poetry. Now, postmodernism is about art, about painting, architecture, about fiction, drama, theory, philosophy. Postmodernism is perhaps the least about poetry. Do you feel so? Why I am asking this question is, do we know who the postmodern poets are? Except probably the most famous. How many of you can tell me the names of 5 postmodern poets? I mean, if you can put it on the chat box or if you can unmute yourself and say, that would be awesome. Name 5 postmodern poets. Do they come to the mind as some postmodern fiction writers would? Yeah, please go ahead.
Participants, please, you're welcome to turn on. You're welcome to interact with the speaker.
Annie Saifi says Kamala Das. I hope I haven't misguided you with my title when confessional meets poetry. Anita Desai. Okay, good. Okay, Crying the Peacock is postmodern. Yeah, but I am asking about a poetry. Yeah, Vanita Desai might have written a lot of poetry as well. Kamala Das definitely is a postmodern poet in more senses than one. But where are the others? Are they still thinking, okay, do you think that, okay, this fellow doesn't know anything about postmodern poetry? No, that is not the idea. Yeah, I don't know much about postmodern poetry. It can be Pablo Neruda. Of course, he can be a very good suggestion for a postmodern poet. But my question is, do we know as much about postmodern poetry as we know postmodern fiction? You know, if you are asked about postmodern fiction, most of you would readily come up with more than 10 or 15 names. Now, what about postmodern poetry? Divya Jyoti, yeah, fiction is predominant. Fiction somehow, for some reason, fiction dominates postmodern landscape. So what about postmodern poetry? What has happened to postmodern poets? Is it that they are not writing good poetry, or is it that there are very few poems being written by postmodern writers? Now, most of the suggestions I am receiving are about postmodern fiction writers, and Italo Calvino, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, these are all fiction writers. But what about poetry? Yeah, Divya Jyoti, poetry is no more read, probably. And if I can rhyme something, poetry is no more dead, because poetry is dead. Is it? Is poetry dead? Allen Ginsberg, yes, Angel, yeah, Allen Ginsberg. So we have a few names, but do we know people like Frank O'Hara or Barbara Guest or Charles Bernstein or Andrew Levy, Jim Rosenberg, Tom Raworth, Jackson Maclow, Michael Basinski? Why aren't these names familiar to us as a T.S. Eliot or an Ezra Pound? Or why aren't we even not mentioning people like Arun Kolatkar or Samuel Beckett as postmodern poets? And probably I got a few names from from confessional poets, Anne Sexton, Kamala Das, Sylvia Plath, probably because of my title. But even that, are we sure that confessional poetry is a sub-branch or an offshoot of postmodern poetry? I'm not sure whether we are sure about it. I wasn't sure, and I had to do a lot of deliberations, and I had to ask a lot of knowledgeable people whether I can safely go ahead with the argument that confessional poetry is an offshoot of postmodern poetry, because I myself found it very difficult to find reliable sources that would tell me, yeah, Manu, you can go ahead, don't worry, confessional is postmodern, it is a part of postmodern poetry. But I wasn't getting that conviction from whatever sources I had referred to. Now, our first room for paper presentations is Slaughterhouse 5. And it wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration if I say that it would be proper to begin a lecture on postmodernism with a quotation about fiction by none other than Kurt Vonnegut, because these are the people we know. And of course, postmodernism is about playfulness, is about saying something and doing something else. So if I say I am going to talk about poetry, definitely I should be talking about fiction. So Kurt Vonnegut had this to say about Slaughterhouse 5. He says, there are almost no characters in this story because most of the people in it are so sick and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. One of the main effects of war is that people are discouraged from being characters. Now, isn't this startling? There are no characters in the story. This is what Kurt Vonnegut says about his own novel Slaughterhouse 5. So can we trust the narrator in the first place? Is there something called truth of narration? We have learned that postmodernism evinces a distrust for the narrative voice. We say that there is no omniscient or a reliable narrator in postmodern fiction, mostly with postmodern fiction, right? So what about poetry? Do we have a reliable narrator in postmodern poetry? And even if we have a reliable narrator, what about the things that that particular narrator says? Especially if it is a confessional poet, can we trust? Can we trust people like Kamala Das and people like Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton? Can we trust their narratorial voice? How much can we trust their narratorial voice? I mean, it is a complex thing, and we say they are confessing. Confession comes from the Christian practice of, it. But in this confession called poetic confession, are they always telling the truth? And the bigger problem perhaps is, if it is postmodern, can postmodern tell any truth? Because some people say there are no truths, while some say there are many truths. But is there a truth? Is there a truth that the narrator of a postmodern poem can tell? That is one very relevant question. Lies or truth of narration? Where does the truth in narration lie in postmodern poetry? Now, I want to speak about confessionalism as a branch of postmodernism, but I would also speak about the confession done by postmodernism about an unholy alliance. Now, the Christian practice of confession, you go and confess your sins to the priest. Now, postmodernism has a confession to make. I will take it upon myself. Okay, I am an unreliable narrator, but I will take it upon myself to confess on behalf of postmodern poetry, on behalf of postmodernism. About what? About an unholy alliance. Oh, an affair, something that is not right, something taboo. An unholy alliance between postmodern poetry and modern literary theory. I found it. I found something going wrong with postmodern poetry and modern literary theory. And if time permits, I would also share with you Derrida's confession about postmodernism and postmodern confessional poetry. Now, it is very unfair to share someone's confession, but let us try if we can do that. Now, what is confessionalism? Confessional poetry or confessionalism, we have studied it, we have learned it from M.H. Abraham's glossary, we have studied in our syllabus. It's a style of poetry that emerged in the 50s, in the 1950s and 1960s, and we would say that it emerged probably in the United States of America. We know the names of Lowell. It is sometimes, also classified as a form of postmodernism, and some people call it an offshoot of postmodernism. I would also tell you, or I would like to say, that postmodernism is a type of confessionalism is a type of postmodernism. Is it that simple? I don't know. But postmodernism has been, confessionalism has been described as a poetry of the personal or the I, and it focuses on extreme, private moments of individual experience, the psyche, the personal trauma, including taboo matters such as mental illness, sexuality, suicide, illicit relationships, unholy alliances. I should not be talking much about confessional poetry to people like you who know a lot about confessional poetry. But let us look at a very famous poem and let us try to read it from a confessional angle. That would make more sense, right? And I am really sorry to John Keats for taking his poem for a confessional reading. I know I will be indulging in blasphemy. I would take Ode to a Nightingale, one of my all-time favorite poems, and I guess many of you would love this poem, and most of us know this poem as well. Now, let's imagine that John Keats was a confessional poet writing confessional poetry. then what would Ode to a Nightingale be? I am trying to give you a blasphemous version of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Now, what is Ode to a Nightingale? If Keats is a confessional poet and if Ode to a Nightingale is a confessional poem, then in a line I would say, Ode to a Nightingale is a poem in which John Keats, the author and his speaker, explicitly complained in the first person about his sexual needs, about his medical problems, about his thanatos, about his death wish. Now, Keats fans would kill me for saying this, that Keats was saying about his sexual needs and his medical needs and his death needs. Is it Ode to a Nightingale? We know that it is much beyond that, but I would say that stripped of all its romantic garb, romantic attire, John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale in the confessional mode can be boiled down to sexual needs, medical problems, death wish and thanatos. How boring would that be? No? Is confessional poetry boring? I don't think so. And the best way to substantiate that would be to say that most of the confessional poets are celebrities. There is a celebrity cult attached to most confessional poets because they say very controversial things. Probably that is why they are stars. Now, they are not such bad people, or that is not the idea, but they are celebrities. Now, my question is, I leave it there, Ode to a Nightingale, for your confessional consumption. We know that postmodernism is intensely subjective. We know that postmodernism rejects objectivity. Postmodernists, post-structuralists say that absolute objectivity is an impossibility. What Matthew Arnold said as disinterested pursuit and this and that is an impossibility because truth is contingent. Everything, meaning is contingent. Everything is in a state of flux. It is relative. So postmodernism rejects objectivity. Postmodernism is intensely subjective. So naturally, confessional poetry is an offshoot of postmodernism, right? Is it so? Is it so simple? Isn't it so simple, or is it so simple? Now let me put, what I was saying was, confessional poetry is intensely personal, intensely subjective. Postmodernism is also intensely subjective, intensely personal. So can we say that hence confessional poetry is an offshoot of postmodernism? I will present another argument for you, and that would probably worry you a little bit, ask a few more questions to you. My question is this: how can confessional poetry, intensely subjective and immensely personal and private, be a part of postmodernism? Because postmodernism is all about the death of the author, the death of the subject. Now, if the subject is dead, if the author is dead, then where is the subjective? Then where can we fit in this confessional poetry? Isn't there a problem, my dear friends? Or is it just my problem? To know that, to understand why there is this problematic, we need to understand a little bit of history. Yeah, thank you for agreeing. I would like to always see some comments, because so I can know whether you are following, whether you are with me, whether you disagree with me. Thank you, Divya, for that feedback. Yeah. So now I'm telling you, we need to know a little bit of history and a little bit of the history of the unholy alliance between poetry and literary theory to understand how confessional poetry can be a part of postmodernism. We have to know about this unholy alliance between poetry and literary theory. So, gear up for some controversy, because I am going to tell you some very bad things about an unholy alliance. And if so, this lecture is also about an attempt to reconstruct and retrace the lost tracks leading to postmodern poetry through literary theory. Through literary theory, we will try to wade through the moth-eaten and the wilderness that has covered the path that takes you to the evolution of poetry. But before that, let's try to tame the beast itself. What is it? What is postmodernism, my dear friends? Yeah, we had a lot of discussions yesterday. We had different and very interesting perspectives on postmodernism from Abhilash and from Science Sir, and it was immensely thought-provoking. Now, let me ask you this question. From your simple understanding, how would you consider postmodernism? Is it like, what is the meaning of post in postmodernism? What would post mean? If eclectic, postmodernism, eclectic, yeah. So postmodernism, what is the meaning of post? We know that, we know that we will have a post-lunch session today, right? Morning session and then a post-lunch session. So what is post-lunch session? Something that comes after lunch. Post-lunch session, or after modern. Yes, Divya. So postmodernism, but is it simply after modernism? This is a question. Is it simply if you are saying that postmodernism is after modernism, then we might be excused for assuming that postmodernism is a continuation of what started its reaction, what started in modernism. But that isn't always the case. Yeah, we can say postmodernism is a continuation of the more radical aspects of Euro-American or British modernism. We can say that it is a continuation of the more radical aspects of modernism. Yeah, but it is, as Divya was pointing out, postmodernism, as the post in postmodernism, is majorly about a rupture with modernist ahistorical bent and the need for closure or autonomy. It is a subversion, a critique, an investigation, a deconstruction of many things that modernism puts forward. I hope you will agree with me. Is that all now? Now, is it simply about that? My dear friends, I will tell you two stories. Now, in a lecture on postmodern poetry, I told you something about Kurt Vonnegut and Slaughterhouse-Five. Now I am going to tell you two stories, not two poems, two stories. Now, isn't it perfect that a lecture on postmodern poetry tells stories? After all, postmodernism is about irony, about unpredictability, playfulness, pastiche, pasting different runners together. So, can't I say some stories? Usually I tell, even in my lectures on other subjects, I would tell about poems. But here, I want to tell stories because it is a lecture on postmodern poetry. Now, the two stories, I'm going to tell you two stories. The story of the tower and the story of the bridge. The story of the tower and the story of the bridge. I would want you to imagine what I am going to tell you. Which tower am I referring to? And which bridge am I referring to? The first is a traditional story. The story of the tower. Excellent. Divya, you are spot on. Excellent. The Tower of Babel. The story of the tower I am going to speak about is a traditional story about a startlingly modernist and postmodernist theme. A traditional story about a startlingly modernist postmodernist theme. And the second story, the story of the bridge, is a purely postmodernist story about a very ancient and traditional theme. Now, first story is the story of the tower. I'm sure that you may not be able to guess the story of the bridge because that is a little metaphorical, but you very well, and hats off to you for guessing it correctly. It is the Tower of Babel. Now you know the story of the Tower of Babel, and what is its theme? Probably the postmodern modernist theme of fragmentation. This is a story from the book of Genesis in the Holy Bible of the Christians. The story of the Tower of Babel. What is the story about? Mankind, proud, all human beings united by one language. They get together. They decide to build a tower in the city of Babel. Purpose? To reach the heavens. The tower will go on and on and on until it reaches heaven. But God isn't so happy. No. God said, no, my dear friends, wait. You are not going to do that. You are not going to reach up here. God isn't enthusiastic. And what was God's response? To make sure that people speak multiple languages, and to make sure that people are divided by multiple languages, he dispersed the languages of the people. Until then, there was only one language, but God decided that each one will speak a different language, and so what happened? The project failed. The Tower of Babel crumbled. People fought among each other. The story of the Tower of Babel. I leave it to you to interpret what this story means in the modern, postmodern, fragmented, disjointed context. Now the story of the bridge. The bridge I am speaking about is another stalwart of postmodernism, George Louis Borges. It was David Foster Wallace who called him the bridge. Yesterday there was this fun competition. They were drawing, and somebody guessed it right. The infinite jest. David Foster Wallace of the infinite jest fame. David Foster Wallace called George Louis Borges the bridge. Bridge between what? He said Borges is arguably the greatest bridge between modernism and postmodernism in world literature. Now my story is about the story of the bridge. Story of the bridge would then be a story written by the bridge, a story written by Borges, and the story is titled, now can you guess, if I have spoken about the Tower of Babel, what am I going to speak about in my next story? A story by Borges. Anybody? A story by Borges that has something to do with the Tower of Babel. Who will come with some suggestion? Richu, excellent. Library of Babel, excellent. Library of Babel by Borges, George Louis Borges also. And what is the theme? Now this is a postmodernist story, a postmodernist text, Pakka postmodernist. But the theme of this story is a very ancient theme. The theme of the earlier story was a very postmodern theme, but the theme of this story is a very ancient theme. What is the theme? The quest for meaning, man's quest for meaning. It started ever since man set foot on this earth. Now this story, the Library of Babel, describes a huge library containing every text that has ever been written. I'm sure that any writer who goes to that library will feel horizons of anxiety. Intertextuality, a lot of problems will be there. The Babel complex, naturally, because it contains all the text that has ever been written. And the narrator of this story takes a postmodern angle, stating that everything has already been written. Everything has already been written. Now, what is the problem? Now, what will I write? Everything is written. People came from far and wide to spend their days combing through the library's contents. Now, our Nasrullah Mambrol of literariness.org, he is creating a wonderful library, and I hope that the library is named Wuthering Heights, but But I am sure that this library, Wuthering Heights, would in many ways resemble the library of Babel, because it would contain most of the texts ever written. Lovely projects are coming up, interesting things. Now, people came to this library, they went through all the books in the library, trying to decode the systems of language, the unknown language systems, to understand meaning. The hope was that one of these books will offer some kind of grand meaning, but after centuries of searching, no one has had any luck whatsoever. This is what happens in the library of Babel. Now, what does this story suggest? Borges' story suggests that man's quest for meaning is doomed. It is doomed to fail. The narrator admits that he himself has wasted years searching the whole library, only to realize that the library will probably outlive, and I would preferably use the word survive, because we will come to survival later. The library will probably survive the human race. Its contents will forever remain intact, and it will be impossible to decipher the meaning of anything in the text. This is the library of Babel, and I think this explains postmodernism in its essence. This is postmodernism in its essence. Now, continuing with that idea of meaning, let me take you to a juxtaposition, a comparison between modernist literature and postmodernist literature. A couple of points only. Postmodern literature is a literary movement that that eschews, that avoids, that abstains from absolute meaning, and instead it emphasizes play, fragmentation, pastiche, intertextuality. It deliberately avoids absolute meaning. Postmodern literature. The literary movement called postmodernism, it rose to prominence in the 50s and the 1960s as a reaction to modernist literature's quest for meaning. If you remember the origins, modernist literature was about the quest for meaning. They were interested in the quest for meaning, and postmodernism arose as a reply to this quest for meaning, especially in the wake of the significant human rights violations that happened during the World Wars, especially the Second World War. Postmodern literature's precursor, modernism or modernist literature, emphasized a quest for meaning, suggesting the author as an Enlightenment style creator of order and mourning the chaotic world. Look at James Joyce, look at T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf. They all suggested that there is meaning, the author is the creator of meaning, and we are in a quest for meaning. However, after what happened during the World Wars, including the Holocaust, the bombings of Japan, all those things, writers began to feel as if meaning was an impossible quest. Now, my dear friends, let me tell you, it didn't happen only in literature. It happened in literary theory as well. Think about what happened to meaning in literary theory. Think about structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, Richard Kearney, in a very influential book titled Modern Movements in European Philosophy, in the introduction to this book, Richard Kearney says that the question of meaning could no longer be taken for granted. And think about the title of Stanley Fish's most famous book, essay. The essay. I think it is a book. Is there a text in the class? Is there a text in the class? It asserts the same idea that meaning is contingent. Meaning is contingent. Meaning is shifting. It is in a state of flux. What is there a text in the class? What is it? It is saying and what is the answer to the question? Is there a text in the class? This is what Stanley Fish asks. And what is the answer? What is the answer to his question? Is there a text in the class? The crux of the question, the pivot of the question is there a text in the class? One. Is there one text in the class? And the answer is there are as many texts in the class as there are readers, as there are readings. As many texts as there are readings and readers. If that is the case, would that lead to a lot of relativity? Would that lead to a lot of contingency? The traditional argument was that all literary works had a fixed, stable, determinate meaning, and that it was possible for a sahridaya, for a good reader, for a competent reader to find out this meaning. If he uses the right approach, a good reader will be able to find out the meaning that is hidden in the text by the author. The author is the creator of the meaning, the text is the holder of the receptacle of meaning, and the reader is the extractor of meaning. So that was the traditional idea. But today there is no stable meaning. Everything is in a state of flux. Meaning is constantly created and recreated by the reader. And that is why is there a text in the class? And earlier the question was, what does this text mean? A teacher would ask, what does this poem mean? But now the question is, what does this poem mean to me in this particular context? What does this text mean to me now in this particular context, in this particular milieu that I am in? Now everything is bound to change for me regarding the text, particularly under the influence of hermeneutics. Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur. The question is reframed as, what is the question? What does the text mean to me now in this particular context? This is the problem. The text does not have one particular meaning, but multiple meanings depending upon the context. The texts do not have a stable meaning, and everything is in a state of flux. In other words, meaning is contingent. And this is exactly what writers, literature also began to feel after the Second World War. Writers began to feel meaning was an impossible quest. The Library of Babel suggests that meaning is an impossible quest. Meaning is contingent. It is not something fixed forever. Now, this is the first romance that poetry had with literary theory. It was a love at first sight. I told you about an unholy alliance, right? You can call it a holy alliance as well if you would love to, but this was the love at first sight. Meaning, the question of meaning post Second World War, what happened? The poets felt that meaning is contingent, and literary theory felt that meaning is in a state of flux, and they met. Eyes met, and poetry immediately fell in love with literary theory. Yes, metaphorically, but something happened with the poetry that was written during that period. Literary theory gradually infiltrated into poetry, postmodern poetry. Literary theorists that crystallized postmodernity in literature include, who are these people? Now think about these people who inscribed postmodernism into poetry. Who are these people? What are these people doing? Roland Barthes, Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, George Louis Borges, Frederick Jameson, Michel Foucault, Jean-Francois Lyotard. What have these people got to do with poetry? But these are the people who put this postmodern idea in, this idea of literary theory into poetry. Why? There were some matchmakers, right? Some go-betweens in this alliance between poetry and literary theory. These people were there. And let us juxtapose, coming closer, zooming in. Let us look at postmodernism versus modernism in poetry. What is it that happens between modernism and postmodernism in poetry? Modernist poetry and postmodernist poetry share many characteristics, not doubt about that. Fragmentariness, exploration of individual subjectivity, states of consciousness. But thematically, modernist poetry and postmodernist poetry diverge in many respects. Of course, it depends on individual poets and is not reflective of any general principle. But I would invite your attention to something that Jerome Massaro in his 1980 work writes. He condemns, rather than T.S. Eliot's belief that poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality, postmodernists propose the opposite. What is it? T.S. Eliot said that poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. His theory of depersonalization, and there were a lot of problems. People criticize, some people criticize, most people seem to criticize Eliot for such an impersonal theory of poetry. He said the poet who feels and the person who writes, those are different people, all those things. Now postmodernism posits the opposite. It proposes the opposite. What is the opposite? Poetry is a turning loose of emotions. Poetry is not an escape from personality, but an indulgence in personality. Hence confessionalism. It is an indulgence with personality. It is an indulgence with the self. Hence confessionalism in postmodern poetry. Now, postmodernism signals a turn inwards into the person of the poet. Instead of transcending inner preoccupations, postmodernism accepts the inescapability of personal thoughts, emotions, passions, and uses these as the object of poetic expression. I'll keep it simple. Postmodernism inherited modernism's tendency towards disruption and things like that. But postmodernist poetry is sometimes fragmentary and thematically unstable. The importance of experimentation and play in the language of postmodern poetry cannot be overstated. There is a lot of experimentation, a lot of play happening in postmodern poetry. And postmodern poetry is the site. Remember this, it's interesting, and it will, yesterday somebody was asking this question. I think this question was posed to Science Sir. What is the difference between traditional feminism and postmodern feminism? And I thought there is a connection. There is an interesting thing that happened in postmodern feminism. What happens is this: postmodern poetry is the site of the articulation of some of the most subversive, deconstructive understandings of gender. It was asked to Abhilash. Yes, Abhilash, thank you. The subversive understandings of gender. And just taking the example of gender, it is through postmodern poetry that many of the then new feminist reconceptualizations of gender emerged. Am I making sense? I will explain. And here I am talking to you about the second unholy alliance between theory and poetry. You know what happened? In the, we had feminism, traditional feminism, and feminism was going all right, everything was fine. But since literary theory emerged, or let us say since the 1950s, 1960s and 70s, everybody was talking about feminism, and there was a lot of things happening in feminism. But in the late 90s, late 1980s, a group of people disagreed with this approach. They had a problem with feminism. Why? They said feminism doesn't represent us. Who were those people? The black Americans. They said feminism is about the white women. It represents the concerns of the white women poets, white women poetry, and it doesn't represent the concerns of black women. And so we want to change the canon. We want an upheaval. We want to change feminism. And there arose what we call black feminism. You know, all of post-structuralism, all of postmodern theory, all of literary theory, I would say, is an incredulity towards totalization. Modern literary theory is against totalization. Now, what is totalization? I always give the simple example of the for blind people who went to see the elephant. One person got hold of the elephant's tail, and he said the elephant is a broom. Another person got hold of the elephant's ear, and he said the elephant is like this. Another person got hold of elephant's leg, and he said the elephant is like a pillar. Now, all these blind people were saying the truth. They were not telling a lie. But what happened was, was that the truth? Maybe not. What happened? They committed the mistake of totalization. If the person who caught the leg of the elephant said, had he said that the leg of the elephant is like a pillar, then he would have been right. He would have said the truth. But he said the elephant is like a pillar. This is the error of totalization. It is not the elephant who is like a pillar, but the leg of the elephant. It is not the tail of the elephant that is like, it is not the elephant that is like a broom, but rather the tail of the elephant is like a broom. The error of totalization. Now, this is something that postmodernism is completely against. Modern literary theory is completely against. And this is something that postmodern poetry also, disparaged, also, subverted. They had great problems with this. And so came, I was speaking about black feminism. And then, so feminism was divided. Postmodern feminism was divided into feminism and white feminism and black feminism. So people thought, okay, now it is fine. Now it is like the political parties, right? So will there be more divisions? No, there was no peace. Then some people expressed dissatisfaction with even black feminism and white feminism. They said, no. This feminism doesn't represent us. It doesn't represent our concerns. And they started what is known as lesbian feminism, because they felt the traditional feminism represented only the concerns of the straight feminist, not the lesbian, the queer gender, the queer people. So they started the lesbian feminism. Now this is, people are using companion mode. Is it fine? I see something like that. Hope it is fine. Or whatever. Okay. Now what has happened is, this is the second time poetry flirted with literary theory. When this and think about the most famous definition of postmodernism. What did Francois Lyotard say in his The Postmodern Condition? How did he define postmodernism? As an incredulity towards meta-narratives. As an incredulity towards meta-narratives. This is anti-totalization. And poetry also evinced the same thoughts. Postmodern poetry said, we have an incredulity towards meta-narratives. We want mini-narratives. Poetry became the means of mounting a challenge to the values, conceptions, and definitions imposed by the established social order. Language is the means by which new understandings of the gendered society and the gendered self are put forward. Literature and poetry have always played a subversive role. Think about the word subversive. Verse and poetry is verse, and then subverse. Poetry, verse playing a subversive role in the human history of human thought. Postmodern poetry, however, is of especial significance to the feminist movement and to the progressive struggle for the recognition of gender and sexuality issues in the mainstream of society. Now, this is the second time theory flirted with poetry, or poetry flirted with postmodern poetry, and hence the romance continued. Theory and postmodern poetry, the romance continues. Now, why is postmodernism difficult? Now, that presupposes, if I am saying that if I am asking why is postmodernism difficult, I am presupposing that postmodernism is difficult. Now, some of you would disagree with me and say that postmodernism is easy, and some of you would tell me that postmodernism is populist, very popular. It is very populist. It espouses populism. However, what happens, for the elite, for the academically elite, for the knowledgeable, for the scholarly, yeah, postmodernism may not be that difficult. But what about the common people, the Aam Aadmi? The problem is postmodernism, the works of postmodernism, postmodernist poetry do not generally have mass appeal. Why? What is the problem? Because of theories which are incomprehensible. They say that there is no reality out there. Reality is constructed through language, and people cannot agree. People will say that no, I am real, I really exist, and postmodern poetry says you don't exist. So what is this? Theories which are incomprehensible, and purposely incomprehensible to all except the well-read academic elite. For example, let us take an example from art, from painting. If you look at 15th century or a 16th Renaissance, painting by Leonardo da Vinci, say, you will enjoy the painting irrespective of whether you understand or not the theory behind the painting. You will be able to appreciate its beauty. We may enjoy something of it without understanding the religious iconography, for example, that is behind that painting. But this is not the case with most postmodernist paintings. We fail to grasp the theory. Provided you don't know the theory, there is nothing in a postmodernist painting, because you will not understand, because you will not be able to appreciate, which explains the bewilderment and distrust of the general public. The works of literature, the poetry that is being written as part of postmodernism seems fragmentary, arbitrary, lacking in skill and lacking in skill and purpose, which it unashamedly is from broader perspectives. And it is not just my argument. I would just give you a couple of people as well who thought along the same lines. The critic Charles Jenks, Jenks, the critic, not the other Jenks, this is Charles Jenks, the critic. He says most people don't have a very clear idea of what postmodernism means. They can be forgiven for this confusion because postmodernists don't always know. Even they don't know what postmodernism is, and even when they think they do, often find themselves disagree. Even those postmodernists who say that they know everything about postmodernism, one postmodernist will say something and the other postmodernist will disagree with that. So there is no coherence, there is no single thought, there is no coherent way of understanding postmodernism. And think about the language that these postmodernists use. And I would give you an example from Judith's Butler, a postmodernist writer, not from poetry, but something she has written, and I'm sure that you will understand this sentence, but you will understand nothing. The language used to describe postmodernism is sometimes ridiculously weird, if not funny, if not terribly tortuous, and obscure at times. For example, take this, listen to this sentence by Judith Butler. She says, and I'm quoting, "The epistemological paradigm that presumes the priority of the doer to the deed establishes a global and globalizing subject who disavows its own locality as well as the conditions for local intervention." Now, if I have a dictionary and if I know the English language, I should be able to understand this sentence. But I am not able to understand it. What is the problem with this sentence? And when you read, for example, Derrida, some of Foucault, some of Lacan, Julia Kristeva, you encounter the same problem. You understand all the words, but you don't understand the sense. Where is the sense? Is it about nonsense? And think about it. I'm speaking about the difficulty in understanding postmodernism. And think about it. Is art or literature, poetry, a criticism of life in postmodernism? Traditionally, we want to call literature a criticism of life. But is it so in postmodernism? No. And poetry is not intended to be a criticism of life in postmodernism. No criticism of life, nothing. Do they sharpen our sensibilities, make us see things, make us see with the eyes of the soul, make us, yeah, you are right, Divya, they make words more important. Very good, brilliant. Make us see deeper. Do they make us see deeper and more clearly? Do they make us more alive to the beauty of the world and indignant at its injustices? Does postmodern poetry call us for a social, responsible citizenship? Does it give us an aesthetic experience? Yes, not at all. Not at all, certainly not. They make us more open to experience and less censorious. Postmodernism is not traditional, is probably anti-art in many ways. I would say postmodern poetry is anti-art in many ways. It is impatient of grandiose claims, incredulity towards meta-narratives, and it has no intention more than entertainment. Entertaining whom? Entertaining a bored society. Now, when I say bored, I have a purpose, because you might remember the word bore. In architecture we had, modernism in architecture could be summarized in a single phrase. What I said, Mies van der Rohe's succinct utterance, less is more. And Robert Venturi, the postmodernist architecture writer, in his book Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, published in 1966, he said, the less is a bore. From less is more to less is a bore. So the postmodernists in architecture, they rejected modernism for messy vitality over obvious unity. We don't want your unity. We would prefer mess. We would prefer kitsch. Exactly, kitsch. We would prefer mess. And Venturi said he likes elements which are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clear, distorted rather than straightforward, messy over obvious, unity, the illogical over the logical, all these things. And coming back to poetry, I was taking you through the illogical, not the illogical, illegitimate, unholy relationship between poetry and theory. So part of the existential problems that poetry faces in postmodernism is due to its romance. Again, that is, and here I am giving you my third point about the romance between theory and poetry. Earlier, remember this, understand this, earlier poetry romanced with death in life. Now poetry romances with theory in death. Earlier poetry romanced with deaths in life. Now poetry, now means in postmodernism, poetry romances with theory in death. Oh, that is very bad, right? In the deaths, making love during the death. Oh my God, such horrible way of making, doing romance. Whose death? Now, whose death is postmodern poetry romanticizing, and whose poetry, at whose death is poetry making romance with literary theory? The death of the subject. The death of the subject. What happened? What happened? The author is dead. The author is dead, right? The author is dead. Many people said that. Earlier, we are familiar with Roland Barthes celebrated 1967, I forgot the year, essay, The Death of the Author. But actually the death of the author was pronounced much earlier. I am not speaking about Nietzsche's Death of God. I want to tell you about this Wimsatt and Beardsley, who spoke of two fallacies, the intentional fallacy and affective fallacy. And defining intentional fallacy, they said that it is an error to judge a poem based on the intention of the author. And they continued that the intention of the author is neither available nor desirable. So, yeah, thank you, Abhilash. 1967, death of the author. But before that, in 1945 itself, these two people, Wimsatt and Beardsley, spoke about the death of the author, albeit using the words intentional and affective, intentional fallacy. And then after, Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, we had Michel Foucault speaking about the death of the author. And his essay was, what is an author, I think. What is an author? And here the author becomes a site. Author becomes a function rather than a person. So again the death of the author was pronounced by Foucault. And Derrida, he also pronounced the death of the author, and he said everything is play. So all these people, and finally the reader response critics, they said the author is dead and the reader is born. We have the reader. What Roland Barthes concludes with in his essay Death of the Author, at the cost of the birth of the reader. Now, I would, if time permits, I would like to take you through modern, three phases of poetry, not the entire history of poetry, but three major phases of poetry: Romanticism, Modernism, and Postmodernism. Because I believe that to understand postmodernist poetry best, it is best to compare, it is better to compare it with modernism and romanticism. Right? As Matthew Arnold said, it's only by way of comparison we can understand the truth precisely. It's only by a way of juxtaposition. So, I am speaking about deaths because I told you it is about the death of the author. It is about the death of the subject. Now, the English Romantic poets transformed their confrontation with the absolute limitation of death into a sublimely self-expressive poetry. Due to time limitations, I won't be going into any detail, but I will give you some examples. Think about what Blake said in his description of the chimney sweeper, clothed in the clothes of death and taught to sing the notes of woe. Or Wordsworth, who was bowled over by a little girl's willful disavowal of deaths in We Are Seven. But they are dead. Those two are dead. Their spirits are in heaven. It was throwing words away, for still the little maid would have her will and said, "Nay, we are seven." Coleridge revealed the mutuality of life and death in his epitaph. You can read it later. Shelley, to a skylark, he speaks about waking or sleeping. Thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream. And think of John Keats above all, our sweet John Keats. See, he affirmed his affinity with death, with negation in Otway Nightingale, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th stanza. It was something like, sometime I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. No, he's half in love with easeful death. Where is the other half? Where is the other half? I think, anybody who falls in love with death falls in love with death because he is in love with life. I think so, because Eros exists if there is Thanatos, and Thanatos exists if there is Eros. The romantic legacy has remained a fascination with death, mortality, finitude, and the romantic poet, who is a melancholic prophet of death in life, feels the full force of life by transcending the threshold of life. What is the threshold of life? Death, which is nothing but death. The romantic poet lives life by confronting death. He's on the threshold of death. Confronting death, the romantic poet lives. Think about American transcendentalism, the American version of romanticism. I'm not going to the examples because you know very well these people, Emily Dickinson, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, all these people, albeit in a different tone, they also were on the threshold of death. They wanted to communicate and commune with death in poetry, and through poetry, death in life. Now coming to modernism, what happens? The language of poetry is fractured, just as the human mind is fractured in modernism. As society broke down, so too did modernist poetry. It stopped confronting death unlike the romanticists. The modernists did not confront death. Instead, the modernist poet became death itself. The modernist poem became death itself, a veritable wasteland. The American high modernists internalized romanticism and transcendentalism, and then they revitalized it in a poetry of fragmentation and disintegration. Ezra Pound, he renders the modern effect in und drang. How our modernity, nerve ragged and broken, turns against time's way and all the way of things. Broken, nerve racked and broken, and we are coming to the chief culprit of modernism, T.S. Eliot. The wasteland presents a poetic consciousness that, because it knows only a heap of broken images, can connect nothing with nothing. The poetic consciousness of modernism knows only a heap of broken images, and so that consciousness could connect nothing with nothing. And the myth of life was replaced by the infertile fisher king. The poet could no longer confront death. He prostrates himself before death. Even the simple poet, when compared to Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams, even he doesn't deny the ruinous rage of discord in his poem Patterson, Book 1, Patterson. There is no direction. Whither? Where will I go? There is no direction. I cannot say more than how. The how, and in brackets, the howl only is at my disposal. This is what he says, and he continues. What happens to Patterson, in the poem Patterson is, Patterson dries up and he becomes the wasteland. I told you, the modernist poet became death. Likewise, Patterson dried up and became the wasteland, the stagnation of spiritual knowledge, the cessation, the end of subjectivity. And he continues, we know nothing and can know nothing but the dance to a measure, contrapuntally, satirically, the tragic foot. What was happening? Know nothing and can know nothing. We know only the tragic foot. Modernist poetry danced with death so much that death became the measure of man. Poetry became death. And then came postmodernism. Modernist poetry gradually receded, but the muted howl, I was telling you about the howl in brackets. Now you can connect it with another howl, I'm sure. The muted howl and the tragic foot did not recede with modernism. It continued. I told you certain radical elements of postmodernism was taken by postmodernism and projected amplified in a better way in postmodernist poetry. Now this is what they did. They did not forget the muted howl or the tragic foot. The beat generation took the muted howl, right? And the confessional poets took the tragic foot. The beat generation took the muted howl, revitalized poetry's ongoing dialectic with death. Ginsberg's howl, probably the biggest achievement of beat generation. Ginsberg's howl saw the best minds of his generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. And then Robert Lowell, the tragic food from modernism, he takes the tragic food. The Robert Lowell, who turned from the modern Eliotesque poetry of dead and broken images to the poetry of confession, he admits that his mind is not right. He started dancing on the tragic food. And Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, Kamala Das, these people followed suit. Postmodernism 1 and 2. I would say that these were the two ways in which poetry came to postmodernism, through the beat generation and through the confessional school of poetry, through the howl and through the tragic food. After the wars, modernist fragmentation declined as the culture rehabilitated itself so fully that the beat generation tried some much needed cultural critique of the establishment. The howl. Poets were politically anxious at the current state of affairs, and this anxiety was internalized not only in the content of their poetry but in the very way they related to language. A little while, my good friend who was giving me feedback all the while, she said language, words. That is the point I am coming to. Not only was the poet's mind not right, but neither was his language. There was a problem with language, and this is known as the linguistic turn. The linguistic turn. Now, this is my fourth and final addition to the flirtation between literary theory and poetry. The romance between theory and poetry consummates in the linguistic turn. What happens in the linguistic turn? Think about it. Ferdinand de Saussure in the 1960s and 70s happened what is known as the linguistic turn, and linguistic turn. Saussure's course de linguistique generale, a course in general linguistics, published in 1916 or 17, and ever since the term linguistic turn has come into currency. Now, what is this linguistic turn? What is this linguistic turn? The idea was, traditionally, it was believed that there is something called reality out there in the external world. There is a reality out there in the external world, and this reality is represented through the instrument of language. This was the traditional belief. There is a reality out there, and we represent that reality using the medium of language. This philosophy is, you can call it positivism or empiricism. But today, in postmodernism, in post-structuralism and structuralism, it is argued that not structuralism but post-structuralism. Post-structuralism argues that reality itself is fashioned constituted in and through language. There is nothing outside of language. There is no reality outside language. If I don't have a language, I don't exist. If I don't have a language, I don't have a reality. In other words, one creates reality through the medium of language, or it is language which creates the human world. I know that for beginners it is very difficult to digest this. To say that it is language that creates the world, it is very tough to swallow. I understand. But in philosophical terms, this is known as linguisticality, and this is the linguistic term. Martin Heidegger, in his book Being and Time, translated in 1962, I guess. So in this book he says that language is the house of being. We exist in language. Language is the house of being. Martin Heidegger. Again, in his work Introduction to Metaphysics, he states, words, it's a very beautiful example as well that he gives. Words in language are not wrappings. We think that words are like the wrappings we have with our, sweets. No, not like that. Words in language are not wrappings in which things are packed for the commerce of those who write and speak. No, you people think that words are simply something that you can use to keep your ideas firmly packed. No, my dear friend, it is not like that. Heidegger says, he continues, he says, it is in words and language that things first comes into being, first come into being and exist. Things exist in words, in language. This then is the linguistic term, and this is linguisticality, and this is the final culmination, this is the consummation of the romance between literary theory and poetry. Poetry wholesomely accepted this idea, and so what happened? This completed the death of the subject. The subject died completely, and what happened? The postmodern poetry embraced language. It embraced the utmost limits of language, and naturally, what will happen when you embrace language to such an extent? The poem becomes the infernal machine. The poetry is a machine, and the poet is another infernal machine. So the poem becomes an infernal, a hellish machine created by another infernal machine called the poet. When theories of language usurp the themes and theses of poems, when theories of language overwhelm the intellectual life of poets, then poetry becomes a hollow shell, an abstract and theoretical application rather than a thing of beauty which is a joy forever. No. Consequently, theorizing language and the poet's systemic place in it has become the bane of poetry. And at the level of, winding up, at the level of professional literary study, semiotics and deconstruction splintered literary monuments, destroyed them completely, including modernist monuments, into slivers of polysemous intertextuality. And poetry followed the academic lead, muffling a defining voice in polyglossia. In Frederick Jameson's words, language, what Martin Heidegger was saying was that language is the house of being. But Frederick Jameson says language has become a prison house. What happened? Theory swallowed all. Poetry submerged into criticism and ultimately linguistics. And what is linguistics? The scientific study of language. Now, if poetry is about the scientific study of language, if poetry does the scientific study of language, how can it survive? How can it survive? And survival. I mean, I wanted to take you to survival and Derrida as well, and just a sentence for you to research on. Derrida's word for confession is probably circumcision plus confession. You can read and understand what it is. It's a very interesting discussion. Probably it is a discussion for another day, because we have reached our time. It's 11:30, so I'm concluding, and I just would recap the 4 major points where 4 instances of the unholy alliance between poetry and literary theory. 1, when it was discovered that meaning is in a state of flux, the death of the author, the birth of the reader. Poetry accepted it. 2, when totalization was rejected by postmodernism, post-structuralism. Black feminism, I gave the example of black feminism and lesbian feminism. Now what happened? Again, poetry wholeheartedly embraced this idea of anti-totalization, of mini narratives. Second alliance between poetry and literary theory. Thirdly, poetry romanced with theory in the death of the subject, in the death of subjectivity. And finally, poetry romanced with theory in the linguistic turn, when reality itself came to be shaped, or reality itself was understood to be shaped by language. So the poet is at the mercy of language. He cannot use language. He is at the mercy of language. And that is the sad predicament of the poet in postmodernism. And I am not giving any answers. I am not saying this is why postmodernist poetry is lesser known. But I think these are some of the reasons. And it is not to say that there are only negatives to the alliance between poetry and theory. There are obvious positives to the alliance between poetry and theory. But again, time limits. So I wind up. Thank you so much, my dear friends, for your kind and patient listening, and a special thanks to a couple of people who were very active on the chat box, helping me with feedback and suggestions and answers. Thank you so much, and the stage is open for discussion.
Thank you, Manu sir, for that amazing session, for conveying all those complex concepts in a very simple and comprehensible manner. So I was just
really do that? Or are you?
Yes. Yes, you did. Seriously. I mean, but the thing that surprised me was that this entire lecture was a postmodern experience for me. I was looking for confessional poetry in an objective manner, but I didn't realize that the entire lecture was actually structured like confessional poetry. You did. You confessed to us about the unholy alliance between theory and confessional poetry, postmodern poetry, that is it. But now we'll have to take the questions, and then we will go to our another postmodern presentation. Meher is waiting, and then we'll have to go to paper presentations too. Yeah. But still, dear participants, you are welcome to post more questions in the chat box. So first I'll go to the questions that are already posted. Yeah. Manju Kumari wants to ask, Sir, you said about straight feminism. We cannot say we are straight totally because all of us have bi traits in us. What is your take on this?
I agree with you 100%. And yes, it is a personal thing. There is nothing, we cannot straitjacket anybody as anything. And it is impossible to make blanket statements. But then we are in the prison house of language, and as Derrida himself understood, you cannot say something without using the language which you are deconstructing. So that is why we have to use words like straight and non-straight or bisexual. But yeah, nobody is fully straight. I cannot make I cannot say this as well, but nobody can be fully straight, nobody can be fully bent, nobody can be fully bisexual, whatever. So I fully agree with you that everyone may have different traits, and there is nothing that is completely, and when we are saying that it is this, we fall into the trap of totalization, and that is what postmodernism is against. And it is fair enough, it is a very lovely argument. It's a lovely thing that postmodernism says. We must not fall into the trap of totalization. We must always, and it is it is an invocation. It is you are being called upon to enjoy the polyphony of things, enjoy the variety of things, enjoy the variety, the hetero nature of things. Instead of auto, as in autobiography, we have to move to heterothanatography, I guess. That is what postmodernism wants to tell you. You don't stick with autobiography, instead you move to heterothanatography. Hetero, let it be all inclusive, let it be about mini narratives as well. Let us bring everybody to the center if we want a center, or let us completely forget the idea of center and margins and do away with that sort of thinking.
Thank you for answering that question well, sir. Manju ma'am, would you like to have further clarifications?
Thank you, Manju Kumari, for the question. Thank you.
I guess no. So we'll go to the next question posed by Divya Jyoti. She was really active during the...
Divya, special thanks. You were amazing, and you were one step ahead of me, which I really liked. You anticipated whatever I was going to say, and hats off to you. Whoever you are, you may be a professor, you may be a student, but whoever you are, amazing. Yeah.
I'm going to go to a question. Could this acceptance of plurality and rejection of authority be considered a social contribution of sorts?
Well, it is a trait. It is a trait, and social contribution, it is a matter of perspective. We cannot, if we want to say that, it depends on where you are. If you are on the ruling side, questioning people are against you. People who rebel against the system are against you. But if you are on the other side, then you stay with the rebels. It is where you stand that decides what your take on it is. So there is no final stance. It can be either way. It is a matter of perspective. I always believe that we cannot make a statement here too, because it all comes down to perspective, where you are. And yeah, it can be a social contribution made by postmodernism, in the sense that we are we ask questions and we rebel against, we subvert existing conventions. It is good from a certain perspective, but if you are on the other side, you will not like it. So I don't know. I am equally baffled as you are, and I'm happy that we have such a situation where there are truths. There are truths, not a single truth, but there are truths.
Thank you for that question, and for being a really good viewer again, Divya. Now we'll go to the next question by Annie Saifi wants you to throw some light on post-humanism.
Well, Annie, post-humanism, again I would say, post-humanism, not directly connected with today's topic, but I would tell you something. Post-humanism is, you cannot look at it simply as something that came after humanism or something that followed humanism. There is something else to it. But the best way to understand post-humanism is now. Because post-humanism is an amalgamation. Earlier the human being, man as the crown of creation, humanism, man was the center of the universe and everything. But now, man has to make space for some two people as well. Which are the two people? The animal world and the technological world. And I think this is the right time to discuss post-humanism, this in the sense these days, because we have uh, what are we doing? In posthumanism, we are sitting with a mouse and thinking about the virus. If the virus can be, by extension, looked at as an animal or a microbe, then you have the best example of post-humanist here. I am a human being, I am clutching a mouse, which is technology, and I am afraid of the virus, which is the third side. So this is posthumanism for you, transcending the boundaries between the human world, the animal world, and the technological world. This will take you to posthumanism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. Now we'll go to Haimanti Bakchi's question. Sir, can we say that postmodernism marks the need for continuous contemplation?
Need for continuous contemplation. Yeah, definitely. Very good observation. I think more than a question, it's a beautiful observation. Yeah, we have to be on our toes always. Continuous contemplation. Yeah, I think this can be a continuation to what Science and Abhilash were talking yesterday, especially the idea that we have to be, how to be a critical citizen, how to be an informed citizen, how to know what is happening. So we have to be alert. We have to be on our toes all the time. And yeah, there is something called playfulness and mock seriousness and irony in postmodernism, which can afford a little bit of slackness on your part. But yeah, because there are multiple truths, and because there is also something happening with Baudrillard and hyper reality and media and fake information. If you look at it from that perspective, fake information overload, information boom, then you have to be always on your toes so that you are never duped by false people. For example, postmodern poetry these days survives through something which is very much fake. There are a lot of poetry anthologies being produced by publishers with the only intention of making money, and they are known as publishing mills, and they tell you that you will get your poetry published and you will be a co-author, a very interesting term that some publishing houses have coined. So you pay 100 rupees, 120 rupees, and you become a co-author in a poetry anthology. Now, I'm not against the idea, because that gives a platform for many people to get published. But the problem is with the promises that they give. People publish thinking that they become, in fact, an author of a book by publishing 1 or 2 poems. And this is the promise that they give, and this is the certificate that they give. And they also give you a certificate saying that you are an Asian Book of World Records or some Book of World Records holder for being the first. If I am publishing, they will say the first Manu Mangattu in 2022 to publish a poem on this. That is known, it is obvious, but that is my world record. And so these kind of things happen. Poetry slams happen where there is a lot of misinformation, but I think that is where poetry lives today as well, because where else is poetry? If poetry is not read, it is as good as dead. Right? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. Well, the comment section is actually becoming postmodern of sorts. We have an epistolary confessional letter for you. Well, your little trick, as kids, when we say to kid, don't take that chocolate, the kid has an increasing urge to have the chocolate, right? So you focused on fiction, but the audience has set their mind on postmodern poetry. And Jemima ma'am has said in a beautiful confessional letters that I did my research on postmodern fiction. So far, I concentrate on fiction alone, but now I found postmodern poetry also quite interesting. The stories of the elephant, the tower, the bridge, and the way you compare romanticism and modernism to understand postmodernism was awesome. Thank you so much, sir. It was really an enlightening session for me.
I will be happy if at least one person takes poetry for their research and writes a paper on poetry in any of the future conferences, postmodern poetry. Please don't fear poetry, my dear friends. I'm speaking to the kids, the students, UG students here. Please don't fear poetry. Poetry is very friendly. Poetry is sweet. It is sweetness and light. You love it, it will love you back, and it is a good friend, a friend who will never leave you. A friend indeed, poetry is. You can trust it, and you can use it for your research as well. It is the easiest, I would say. I have found poetry the easiest when it comes to writing papers or writing doing any sort of research. So please do. And if there is another conference on postmodernism someday, please write a paper on poetry. Please do.
So Annie Saifi, in continuation with the post-humanism doubt, she has, I think it's beyond the scope, but you can give an example. Is post-humanism limited to artificial human biology or science fiction, like in Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go, or can we apply post-humanism to general literary text also? If yes, can you please give an example?
Post-humanism can be applied to any literary text, not literally, any text. There is no theory that cannot be applied to any text, provided you have a logical way of reading the text. If you have a logical way of reading something into the text, fair enough. This is the question should be not which theory I can apply to which text, but how. It is always about how. It is never about whether I can. No, you can. There are warring forces of signification hiding in every text, without doubt. Look at Derrida. He finds meaning and he finds lack of meaning. He finds problems in every text. So it is up to us. If we can find a word, you can take that word and stretch it to its utmost limits, and you can say that, yeah, I find postmodernism here. If we can find post-colonialism in The Tempest, if we can find Oedipus complex in Hamlet, we can also find post-humanism in any text. Promise. Go ahead, have that confidence, and do a close reading. Do a close reading for both senses. Shut out the world and get into the world of the text, whichever text you are taking, and go through the text word by word, and you will find warring forces within which will tell you that see, come, here I am post-humanist, here I am getting post-humanist, there are post-humanist elements within me, come find me out. It's a hide and seek game. They are all there, you just need to find them out. Those meanings, those interpretations are all hidden in every text. I believe so. I don't think that there is any text that cannot be interpreted using any particular theory.
Well, like Picasso said, you must learn the rules and then break it like an artist. Now, Angel Tess wants you to elaborate on Derrida's Confession.
Derrida's Confession. Thank you for asking that question, because I wanted to speak about it as part of the lecture itself. Derrida's Confession is something very interesting. Derrida is a person who, right through his life, and now I am not speaking about the Confession from the angle in which I was about to speak for the lecture. I am replying to this question about Derrida's Confession. So the thing, I am not connecting it with confessional poetry at all. Derrida's Confession is, in simple words, I would say, in the beginning, when Derrida started writing, he was very much against taking photographs of himself. Why? Because he believed that the author is a sight, the author is dead. He believed that the author must not be a mediating space between the reader and the text. The text was all important. So he didn't even allow people to click photographs of himself, and this was how he was for the majority of his life. But towards the end of his life, he brought, this particular book was published titled Jacques Derrida / Circumcision. Here, Derrida, the most striking part of this book is divided into two parts. One, a critic's interpretation of deconstruction, and Derrida told him, you should not use any of my words to interpret deconstruction. You should not use any of my words or phrases to interpret deconstruction. That is the first part of the book, and the footnote to the book is written by Derrida himself, and the footnote is actually the second part, and you are always at a doubt as to which part you should read, the first part or the second part, because which is Derrida? Is it the interpretation, or is it, because the text looks like the first one, but we are told that it is Jacques Derrida and it is circumcision. So it happens in the footnotes to the book. And here the most striking aspect of this book is, at the end you will find a lot of photographs of Derrida, and definitely it clearly shows a shift in perspective of Derrida, right? The earlier Derrida who refused to allow people to take photographs, and this Derrida who himself, for the book, allowed all these pictures to be published. And he spoke about his own life, his guilts, his problems, various things. Yeah, he always is worried about falling into the trap of language. He never wants himself to be deconstructed, and he never wants to fall into the trap of totalization, but still he makes very interesting statements. For instance, he gives a tribute to his mother. Usually people pay a tribute to somebody after they are dead, but Derrida's mother was alive when he was writing this, and he wrote this tribute saying that as if he was writing at a future time after his mother is dead. And this is where Derrida's concept of survival becomes very important, and I think there is a big point about survival, because survival is equally about life and death. For my survival I have to wear mask. Now it is about life. If I am saying it survived, it is about death, right? There is another way to look at survive, the word survive. Derrida wrote a book. Derrida's, I think his letters were published at the end, and the title of the book is At the Truth Finally. Now the word finally is very interesting. Finally doesn't mean at the end. Finally here doesn't mean at the end. For example, we will say, finally I found out that this is the thing. So finally. Here finally means eternally. Eternally. So these are the kind of confessions that Derrida make, and you survive. And he wants himself to be survived in both senses. Survived through his confessions, and that is circumcision. Circumcision is a portmanteau. Derrida is very good at these clubbing words. It is circumcision plus confession. Remember that he is an Arab Jew and he was circumcised as well. Now circumcision, to provide a hint, circumcision, cutting a part of your body, a scar on your body. Now this happens before you even get a name, which means before you are named, means before you have a signature and before you have a life, because before you are having a reality, because you don't have language when you are when you are being circumcised. So all these things plus confession, circumcision plus confession becomes circumcision. I think you should read that book. I don't know whether this book is available anywhere, because it is a very rarely found book, but if you can find it, I would say it's the best book written by Derrida, Circumcision. You will love Derrida after you read this book.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. Sakshi Bansal wants to ask, in his Library of Babel, Borges beautifully conceptualized the idea that meaning always escapes us. So can we say that it does not exist at all? And if that is the case, where does language stand?
Meaning, we cannot say meaning does not exist. All we can say is it is in a state of flux. It is always already gone. It is always in a state of flux. It exists, but in a state of flux. It is contingent. Meaning is relative. And where it is, what was the second part of the question, Richu?
Where does language stand?
Yeah, the language is everything. Language is the ultimate for the postmodernist. Language is the non, it is the ultimate. Language decides everything. Everything is subsumed under language, or without language nothing exists. So our reality is shaped by language, our literature is shaped by language, our expression is shaped by language. Earlier we thought that we express through language, but now language shapes our expression, and if we don't have language we cannot express. Language is more important, not expression. Everything is subsidiary to language. Language is the, if I can use a word, is the transcendental signifier and the transcendental signified in the post-structuralist world. I know I am making a very false statement, but I think you will get my idea that in the postmodern world, post-structuralist world, language is the transcendental signifier and the transcendental signified, because there is nothing outside of language.
Now we'll go to the last question of the session. Javi wants to ask, do you think the loss of form and format as is seen in today's poetry, which is a form of microfiction, is a result of postmodernism?
Absolutely, absolutely. What has happened is with postmodernism, people it gave a free license to experiment. This is the point. It gave a free license to experiment, and that is why whenever we think of postmodern poetry, we don't think of a poem with a rhyme or rhythm. We think of free verse. And honestly speaking, most of postmodern poetry is trash. Tell nobody, most of postmodern poetry is trash, because everybody writes something and the only condition is you should not make any sense. Now I am not speaking like a scholar, I am speaking like a student. I am speaking like a student and I am telling you, it doesn't make any sense. If it doesn't make any sense, you have written postmodern poetry. This is the student's version of postmodern poetry, and I guess that is universal. It is true with most postmodern poetry. It refuses to mean, and that is why this unholy alliance between literary theory and poetry has been so detrimental, because if poetry does not have a meaning, if poetry is about anything that anybody can write, then people find a lot of meanings in that meaninglessness. So aesthetic values are completely forgotten. Nobody is worried about aesthetics anymore. Yeah, we can say that it has broadened the canon and it has widened the canon, because it says that there is no high literature and low literature, popular literature has come into the canon, all good. But shouldn't there be some criteria as to what is poetry? Now look at some of the poetry that some of these famous postmodern writers are writing, and I remember somebody who read a poem and wrote a letter to the poet with a just ha ha ha. And he simply wanted to suggest that it is just shit, crap. These are words postmodernists use. Now don't find fault with me for using this, because in postmodernism, where less is a bore, crap and shit are the holy terms. These are the words that they use frequently. They don't want to mean anything. So it is unfortunate. Form, format, all these things, too much worry about the language part of it, the scientific part of it, and very little worry about the thematic and the content part of it. Form and content. We always believed that poetry is about the proper amalgamation of form and content, word and sense, vak and artha, vagartha vivo, like Paramashiva and his five, all those things we know. But here there is no sense, only sound, no sense. Now, in this nonsense, we have form and format, nothing else. Yeah, it is the result of postmodernism, because even most modernism, despite all its obscurity, all its paradox and difficulty and irony, it tried to make some sense, at least it tried to make sense most of the time, though it was very dismal sense that it made.
Thank you, Manu sir. I think it has sufficiently answered Javi's question. And I thank all the participants and the speaker for being such a wonderful, for making this session such a wonderful one. Now, I would like to wind up, because this session was not only about postmodernism or the limits of or getting it limited to poetry. This is also about generating much research interest and giving motivation to researchers that you can do it. You can do anything you want. And that's what Seher has also said, that she feels more experimental after listening to the speech. And I would like to conclude with a quote by Jacques Rousseau in his Confessions. I will speak it out. I have resolved on an enterprise which has no precedent, and which, once complete, will have no imitator. My purpose is to display to my kind a portrait in every way true to nature, and the man I shall portray will be myself, simply myself. I know my own heart and understand my fellow man, but I am made unlike anyone I have ever met. I will even venture to say that I am like no one in the whole world. I may be no better, but at least I am different. Be different, be you, venture upon your research interest, be bold in your research interest. And that is how I will officially end this session. Now,
Thank
we will
you,
have...
Rishu, for wonderfully anchoring this session. It was very new for me, such an anchoring session. And you have quoted Rousseau aptly. And interestingly, this particular paragraph was taken by Derrida for analysis. This is from Rousseau's Confessions, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Rousseau's Confessions. And Derrida was interested in analyzing other people's confessions. He analyzed Saint Augustine's Confessions and Rousseau's Confessions. So thank you, very good. Thank you. God bless.
Something very... That would what Derrida would do.